Sergio, che dici? Possiamo cominciare? Vuoi spiegare? Yeah.
Festival di Venice presentano il loro nuovo volume Moneta Impero. In occasione del Festival di Venice presentano qui il loro nuovo volume.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. Today we have a very interesting event. You already know Dr. Caracciolo. He was here last month giving a fantastic overview of the geopolitical situation in the eastern countries. Today there will be the occasion of the Limes Festival, a presentation. The topic will be money and empire, currencies as a geopolitical tool. Moderator will be Lucio Caracciolo, that you already know. And the first speaker will be, after the brief introduction, Lucio, Dario Fabbri. He's expert in the social political situation in the United States and Eastern countries, Middle East. And later, we'll be joined by Alessandro Aresu, if I understand correctly, in about half an hour, who is one of the scientific advisors of Limes. So this is the fourth event we have in a row about social issues that we want to open to the scientists so that we get off the lab sometimes and learn about the real world. Thank you for coming. Thank you, you guys, for being here and dedicating this time to IIT.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. This is my second opportunity of having a discussion with you, which is a very welcome opportunity. And the theme, the issue at stake this morning will be, in fact, the issue of the festival, which will start this afternoon in Palazzo Ducale and will last up to Sunday, so you are all welcome to Ducale if you wish. And the title of our conference is Money and Empire. What are the relationships between a currency and the empire, or if you wish, the state, which issues this currency? There is always some kind of very robust relation between any kind of empire and its currency, starting from the Sextertium and the Roman Empire up to the American dollar and the United States of America. We will discuss this relationship looking at two very specific cases, namely the dollar-America relationship on one side, and here is my dear friend Dario Fabbri, who is the expert on that. And then later, Alessandro Aresu will tell us something about the euro and Europe, which in fact, to some extent, is also a relation between a currency, the euro, and a would-be empire, which is Europe. Let me give you some very few remarks about, in specific, the kind of relationship we have here in Italy and in Europe with our currency. We tend to forget that our currency, the euro, was not essentially a monetary or even an economic idea. It was, by the way, basically a geopolitical idea. Why? Because it was, I would say, invented in the early 90s because of the changing in the geopolitical landscape here in Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Empire and the Soviet Union herself, gave up the old fault lines and produced a new space for some kind of geopolitical and monetary and economic experiments. The idea was that since we had no more enemy, but we had now a central power in Europe, Germany, the unified Germany, from the point of view of other European countries, first of all France and Italy, there was some kind of risk of being, I would say, Germanized in the sense of having the German currency, the Deutsche Mark, and the German central bank, the Bundesbank, as the leading power in not only financial but also economic and political issues here in Europe. So the euro was at the very start a reaction from some French, Italian, and other European leaders against the risk of a kind of German, more or less absolute leadership in the new Europe, which was taking shape. As we all know, exactly about new identity and kind of in the late 90s about of now what happened and I think that but essentially what was the German power in the center of Europe, German to diplomat told me once for notifying Iran European countries in the view, maybe some of you currency is a sign, mark of your culture, which is not exactly, for example, the way we Italians were used to see our relation to our beloved liretta. Now, so in this trajectory from the early 90s to today, the Germans were able to change to some extent the meaning and the sense of this currency and to an area of this specific currency which is more or less led by Germany. In this area we have a central power which is Germany, which is absorbing liquidity from the other European countries and exporting deflation to, for example, Italy and others, because of the very fact that Germany is the leading European export power. It always was and more or less is still now an export-led economy and is becoming also to some extent a geopolitical power. We had an example of that, for example, a couple of weeks ago when the German Chancellor, with, of course, the French President, managed to produce some kind of agreement between Russians and Ukrainians in Minsk about the ceasefire in Ukraine, something which normally one would think should be a European affair, having, for example, the President of the European Council or the European Commission or the so-called European Foreign Minister discussing and negotiating that. On the contrary, we had number one and number two in Europe, the German and the French leader, who were the leading factors in this kind of negotiations. And this tells us much about the meaning of this currency, which was meant as an integrating factor in Europe. Take a look to this map, for example. what we call the euro monetary disintegration, in which we see that we already have different Europes in the euro area, namely I would say, the Nordic Europe center of gravity around Germany, with France as an ancillary power, and the so-called peaks. We are in a peak country, as you know, namely Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and maybe some others. And then we have the area in the central eastern part of Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, which are industrially, economically linked to Germany, so they are to some extent also part of our economic area, but are euro-free. They do not have the euro. They still have their national currencies. And then we have a couple of other currencies and areas in the very northern part of Europe, Sweden, Denmark, etc., which are again essentially part of the German area of economic and industrial influence, but still have their national currencies. This is the geopolitical byproduct of a project which was based on the idea that you can have a currency without a state. It was and still is the first case, as far as I know, in world history that a group of countries giving up parts of their national sovereignty produce a currency which doesn't have anyone at the political helm. There is no political leader who is responsible for that. And I'm concluding on that, of course, and I'm giving the floor to Dario. And what is also revealing is that one of, or I would say the most important political leader, maybe after the German Chancellor in Europe now, is the President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who in the absence of a political center of responsibility is taking political decisions which normally do not belong to the area of responsibility of any central banker. Mario Draghi has political skills. He has some kind of Italian flexibility and more or less German outlook in his body language. So he's a perfect mix for this kind of a very special job. Now we know that since he has historically, I would say, also special relations to the American financial and political pole of gravity, he is able to negotiate also with the Americans, and the Americans have a stake, of course, in the European market and in the European Union. So we have this construction which was based on the idea of containing Germany, which is producing another kind of geopolitical effect, which is a more disintegrated, a more renationalized Europe, or even divided inside the very nations of Europe, which is not, and this is the very central point, which is not a global player. The players, more or less global in Europe, are still the leaders of the most relevant countries in Europe, the German Chancellor, the the French President. Since I'm Italian, I would imagine that also the Italian Prime Minister may play a role from time to time, but essentially we still don't have a Europe which could be considered the backup of the euro. So this is my very short introduction to this issue, but we go now to a much more strong relation between an actual currency and an actual empire, namely the US dollar and the United States of America. And for that purpose, I leave the floor to Dario.
Thank you, Lucio, and thank you, everybody here for coming. I've been given a pretty daunting task here, which is to explain how the dollar actually helps the U.S. to retain their global supremacy, and more specifically, how the dollar helped the U.S. out of the latest crisis, even though the crisis which was actually caused by the U.S. Broke out in the U.S. In order for me to do so, I think we should take a step back and analyze together how usually commentators, pundits, analysts relate to the U.S. superpower dome, so to speak. Usually when we talk about a U.S. superpower dome, we state three main pillars. The first one is the armed forces, the military might, so to speak, the U.S. being able to impose their own will onto the others. We know that when the U.S. wage wars, they have mixed results, but still being able to affect global relations with the armed forces is considered one of the three main pillars of their superpower dome. The second one, Joseph and I would call it soft power. The U.S. being able to impose their own truth onto the others, not only in the Western world, even in other parts of the world with mixed results, again, but still the U.S. soft power is one of the three pillars. And then we have the dollar being the global reserve currency. Most internationally traded commodities, as we know, are priced in U.S. dollars, and the dollar is just on the same level with the aforementioned first two pillars. To me, this very assessment sports a fatal flaw, as it fails to recognize a principal causality between the first two factors and the third one. And that's a lesson really important to understand the U.S. power and the U.S. empire, and why, at this very moment, China and Europe, for that reason, cannot replace the dollar as the global currency. Because the first two factors I mentioned, armed forces and soft power, actually produce the strength of the dollar. It's not vice versa. It works this way. The armed forces, especially the U.S. Navy, is what created the so-called globalization as we know it. The U.S. potentially being able to cut off each and every competing nation from the international maritime trade created the globalization as we know it. Is not because human beings, or at least not only because human beings tend to trade globally. It's because there is a country at the center of the system that imposes its will on the others and create the maritime trade. Secondly, this soft power, of course, makes U.S. institutions trustworthy, as seen by international investors. The U.S. institutions, as polarized and dysfunctional as they are, especially during this period of time, are still considered, are still perceived around the globe as effective. And the rule of law, which is a principle, a vital principle of the U.S., it's something that draws money towards the U.S. In plain English, international investors believe, they're confident that even during dark times, the U.S. authorities won't dare to seize, to confiscate their own money, their own investments in their country. And that's something, for example, that many investors don't think as much of other countries around the globe. China, for instance, but Russia, and we could go on. So we have the dollar being that strong, having that strength produced by the U.S. armed forces, the U.S. institutions, and of course, the U.S. middle class for that reason. And the U.S. still supports the widest and the deepest middle class around the globe. So many export-driven countries tend to look at the U.S. as the best market where to sell their own goods, where to sell their own products. Having said that, now we can understand why an empire needs to have these very pillars to become an empire, and even more so, and even more importantly, needs these pillars to have a global reserve or a global currency considered the most appreciated reserve around the globe. As we saw in the last crisis, as I said at the beginning of my speech, I still remember in 2008 and even 2009 for that reason, still many analysts and pundits that were predicting the upcoming fall of the U.S., the upcoming fall of the dollar would be replaced by some other currency, something that actually didn't happen. Not only that, but we saw the dollar strengthened during this period of time. And we saw the euro crumbling to some extent. And we also saw, of course, China not being able to replace the U.S. at the center of the financial system. There are many reasons for this phenomenon to happen, but the dollar is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, for what did not happen, even if it was predicted. Quantitative easing, now we're going to experience that here in Europe, as you all know, was launched in the U.S. in 2009 by the head of the Federal Reserve. By then, it was the head, Ben Bernanke. Actually, the U.S. was not the first country to launch in quantitative easing. The UK and Japan, for different reasons, had already done that in earlier years. But the U.S. quantitative easing, which is basically printing money to spur the national economy, is something very interesting because it's related to the empire. Quantitative easing, of course, printing money again, usually means devaluating your own currency to spur the economy and to make interest on the U.S. Treasury bonds go down, to lower. These very reasons actually caused a backlash around the globe that prompted other countries to come to aid the U.S., to come to finance the U.S. recovery. Now we're going to see that the U.S. recovery, which is ongoing, has actually been financed by other countries. Usually the U.S. uses, and we go back to empire again, war or federal spending to get out of crisis. We saw during the Second World War when military spending got the U.S. out of the crisis. We saw that again even during the Reagan years, even though President Reagan was an appreciator of the so-called supply side economics. But still, during his own term, his own two terms actually, military spending increased. Actually, it reached the same level of the Vietnam War, and even federal spending increased. And the Reagan administration was just like this one, was actually able to convince the others to pay for the military buildup of the U.S. that actually then pushed the Soviet Union to collapse. Something really similar happened during the George W. Bush's years, when especially Japan and China financed the so-called war on terror, and they were happy actually to do so by buying U.S. Treasury bonds. They were happy to do so because the U.S. was bogged down in no strategic theaters during those years. Something similar happened with the Obama administration. As I said, quantitative easing makes interest rates go down and makes a currency to devalue it. And that's very important for G20 economies, for example, export-driven economies that tend to sell, as I said, their own goods into U.S. They need a currency to stay as strong as a currency that allows U.S. citizens to buy their goods. And even another reason, they feared that their own currencies would appreciate too much vis-a-vis the U.S. quantitative easing. So between 2009 and 2013, we saw actually $2.5 trillion pouring into the U.S. from G20 economies. They bought dollars and then they parked these dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds. 65% of U.S. Treasury bonds that were issued during that very same period of time were bought by foreign central banks. And the stats are staggering because $2.5 trillion is almost as much as the first two rounds of quantitative easing, which accounted for $2.6 trillion. So basically, the U.S. didn't pay for its own recovery, even though, as we know, the Obama administration has been accused of, has received charges of spending too much money and creating inflation and so on. Still, it was other countries that paid for the U.S. recovery because of the dollar, because of what we said at the onset. Of course, it was a forced reaction by emerging countries, and their reactions actually were furious. We still remember Brazil's finance minister saying that we were in the midst of a currency wars. Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, actually said that the U.S. quantitative easing made no sense. The governor of China's central bank said that the U.S. was just pursuing its own interest at the detriment of other countries around the globe. Because I like what happened, as I said, during the Bush administration, when they were happy to finance a useless war. In this case, actually, they felt compelled to intervene, even if they didn't want to. Just because the dollar in the U.S. as a financial center is so important and at the center, then again, of the system. Actually, the pain for emerging countries, just a few stats on that front, to understand the phenomenon, Japan spent more than $500 billion to finance the U.S. recovery. China spent $550 billion to finance U.S. recovery. Then you have Brazil, more than $100 billion. You have UK, you have India, and even a country that have GDP per capita very low, were compelled to spend to keep the level, the life quality level of the U.S. this high, even if the real level is very low. And of course, as I said, the reaction was furious, but in 2013, they didn't know that their pain was not over. Actually, they were stuck into a two-speed phenomenon, two-speed mechanism that hadn't run its course. In May 2013, Bank Bernanke announced that the Federal Reserve was about to gradually decrease the quantitative easing, as it's called, was about to taper in. Tapering is just an announcement, was just an announcement back then, but as we know in finance, announcements are usually more important than actual facts, as it happened, and Alessandro will explain that later on with the BCE. But still, in a couple of months, from May to July 2013, the backlash was dramatic in emerging countries. Stock exchanges in emerging countries lost $1 trillion because investors were taking off the money from those stock exchanges and putting back into the U.S. because they thought the interest rates would go up. And we saw, as you remember, during that period of time, many riots, protests in Turkey, Gezi Park, in Brazil, in July, also in South Africa, Gaudeng's protests, because economic conditions were deteriorating just because of an announcement made by the Federal Reserve. And I'll conclude my speech. China wasn't that much affected by tapering. It's not in emerging countries, of course. But still, China during 2013 and 2014 realized how important the U.S. still is at the center of the system with the dollar. And between 2013 and 2014, China tried to scare the U.S. to some extent. We know that China is the major holder of U.S. debt in the world, with $1.2 trillion. Actually, in 2013, it was at $1.3 trillion. And in 12 months, we saw the Chinese holding decreasing from $1.3 trillion to $1.2 trillion in 12 months. But U.S. authorities realized that actually there was another country, a small country, a European one, that was dramatically increasing its holding of U.S. reserves. Now, its own holding accounts for $750 billion, which is 70% of its GDP, and it's Belgium. The U.S. authorities realized that Chinese were hiding behind the Belgian government to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, while still trying to threaten the U.S. that they might dismiss their own holdings. And this very maneuver and procedure is a clear example of the so-called trap inside which China is stuck, something that resembles pretty closely the sterling trap that France experienced. Between 1926 and 1931, France was actually stuck in the same situation as China. France had huge amount of pounds, of sterling pounds in its deposits, and the pound was actually losing value, was devaluating for several reasons. And France wanted, France's central bank wanted to decrease its own holdings because it felt like they were eroding with the sterling losing its value, and also because they didn't want to prop up an antagonist, a rival anymore. So between 1929 and 1932, France's central bank dismissed its entire portfolio. First it switched to dollars, then it switched to gold. The problem is that, as we know, you cannot do that in a day. It takes a lot of time. It takes at least several months. And during that period, your own holdings lose value. You have them in dust, as they say. And in 3 years, France's central bank got on the verge of collapse, was very close to bankruptcy. The French government had to bail out the central bank. This example, which characterizes the predicament where China is stuck, is usually stated in internal papers at the U.S. Treasury, because, of course, there's a debate raging on in the U.S. as to whether China will dismiss one day the holdings of U.S. debt that it's got. And then in 2012, U.S. Treasury paper just stated as much, that China doesn't want to end up like France in 2030s. And that, of course, gives us the reality of the dollar at the center of the system, at least as seen from the U.S. Just to conclude my speech, we have another example to me, which is pretty clear, and then we're going to move on to the euro, which, of course, is a currency without a state behind it, without a sovereign state behind it, which is, as we said, one of the pillars that are important to have a global currency. Bitcoin, as I bet you know, is the virtual currency that has been launched some years back. And it tends to fluctuate on the markets pretty dramatically because it doesn't have anyone behind it as a statement, actually, by choice, we'd say. And in the past months, Bitcoin founders and analysts have been lobbying U.S. Congress to have the U.S. Parliament regulate the currency. Basically, they were trying to hold on to the sovereignty of the U.S. to have it behind their own virtual currency. Otherwise, it would not survive. So with Bitcoin, we understand, as it seems that Europe, we don't know, that with no sovereignty, you cannot have a viable currency or a global currency for that reason. The U.S. knows that much, that they have a huge trade deficit, which of course is a flaw. We look at that as a negative aspect, but the huge trade deficit allows the dollar to go around the globe. You buy goods, you give them your dollars, and the dollars go around the globe. And when they have a lot of dollars in their hands, when they have heaps of dollars in their hands, they're going to defend the dollars because they're going to defend their assets. They're going to defend their own money. They got them in their banks. They didn't want them to devalue it that much. So this trap, of course, and the empire, the armed forces, the soft power, and the U.S. institutions make the dollar still the global currency. And if Europe and China do not change several aspects of their own institutions, I believe that the dollar will be still the global currency for years to come. Thank you.
So I could sum up your speech by paraphrasing Liza Minnelli: the dollar makes the world go round. And that's the basic difference between a normal currency and normal national currency and the US dollar. Namely, the fact that this currency has, at the same time, the national currency of the United States of America and the international currency of global trade. You may distinguish the imperial currency when you have a currency which is, as I said, at the same time, the nominal currency of a state and the effective currency of international trade. And I do remember when we Europeans, and I would say to quite a relevant part, or we Italians imagined to build this new currency which we have now in our pockets, the euro, the American reaction was not enthusiastic, I would say. There were many pressures coming from the other side of the Atlantic towards the leading European countries, because some people in the United States was afraid by the very idea of a European currency being or becoming a challenger of the US dollar on the global arena. That didn't happen, as we know. The euro is a relevant currency in international trade, but it is not a challenger, a true competitor to the US dollar up to now. I don't know about the future. But to have a clearer idea about our present and maybe our future, it may be useful to listen to Alessandro, who will give us some hints about the euro and Europe. Bye, Alessandro.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Sorry for being late, but I was at the opening conference at the school, and it's good to move up to the Italian Institute of Technology. Money and Empire, that's the title of Lima's last issue. Money, Empire, and Europe. Europe and Empire. It seems like a joke today to say empire and Europe together, but it hasn't been like this for a long span of history. If we take the long view of history, of course, Europe has been connected with the relevant empires, but also if we take, say, a view of the debates of just 10 years ago, you could go around a lot of books talking about the coming new European empire, a potential challenger for the United States. There were some people arguing that this century will belong to not to Europe, but to the European Union itself. If you take, there was a book just out in 2008 by Parakan. It talked about the three empires, United States, China, and the European Union. What happened 7 years ago? It seems strange to talk about Europe and empire. Let's go a little quickly between analyzing possible kinds of empire that present Europe resembles. Is it an empire of force? I do not think so. Is it an empire of soft power, where the ability of Europe to cooperate and to overcome conflicts are being a model for other international cooperations, and where the European social model seems to be relevant for others? Well, this might be. Is it an empire of law? Surely laws are an important part of Europe's projection both internally and externally. So it is an important part. Is it an empire of money? It was supposed to be, certainly, with the creation of the euro. The euro was built out of the project of creating politics out of money. Hans Tittmeyer, then president of the German Bundesbank, put it very clearly. Monetary union is not just a technical matter, but it in itself, it is to some extent a political union. So this was a goal clearly stated by the European Union most relevant country, and the overall perspective concerning the evolution of the euro in bringing political union out of economic union was frequently related with the episodes of crisis. Crisis in European ideology played this role. It was Jean Monnet himself who talked about the power of crisis in order to overcome obstacles. And Romano Prodi, as president of the European Commission, said that he was sure that the euro would oblige us to introduce a set of new policy instruments. But in a non-crisis mode, this wasn't possible. So the political constraints for introducing new instruments leading to a clear and credible political union aren't there in a non-crisis environment. But Prodi himself argued that one day a crisis, a major crisis, will come and will force us to come together. So this doesn't seem, I mean, the reality doesn't seem to subscribe to the script of the forefathers and the nephews of European integration. Enter the crisis. On the one hand, you have European complacency, I'd say, self-righteousness. It is about the US, it doesn't involve us, this is the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, our capitalism is safer. And then you have another episode, which we often forget about, is that in 2009, within the G20, emerged a kind of stimulus consensus, let's say new Keynesian consensus about the answer to the crisis. And then in 2009, Germany and then the socialist minister of finance, Per Steinbrück, were instrumental in killing this kind of new stimulus consensus. Then came the elections in 2010 of the UK, and then the austerity consensus was actually built, but Germany played a role even in that time. But this happened also to inside another general trend, which I consider very important to highlight. It is the fact, the simple fact that the state as a political entity has survived. We didn't think, particularly for a decade, during the 1990s, that states, nation states, were here to stay in the international environment. We thought that states were going to wither or fade away in order to accommodate much more relevance of international organizations, NGOs, international courts, and of course the power of finance. But the fact is, the state refuses to simply wither away. The state is still an important force, an important political claim. You don't have terrorists claiming they want to build some kind of union or community. They claim they are the the Islamic State. You don't have Boko Haram claiming they're building a new cooperation union or NGO in Nigeria. They want to build a state there. So the state remains relevant. I'm not saying that the state is the only relevant political entity. I'm saying that it is pointless to simply put the state away, to consider the state as not being important. Because when you have, for example, episodes of statelessness at the international level, they are a major problem. When you don't have a state and you have a conflict, or you have a conflict that destroys a state, it's very hard to imagine what to do next. And state building it's easy to say, but it's very hard to practice. The European Union is not a state. It is, I define it a continuous bargaining process between increasingly different entities. This is a line that can summarize Europe since 2008, and particularly since 2010. It is also true that in today's Europe, states, particularly one state, are more relevant than a few years ago. This method of bargaining between states is increasingly at the center stage of European politics. We might like it or not, but that's how they try to solve the never-ending problem between democracy and decision-making in something that is not a state. What is interesting, even politically, about today's Europe, and I wrote about him in an article I co-wrote with Andrea Garnero, is that in this system of bargaining between states, we have no statesman. There is a lack of statesmanship. We often complain about with nostalgia, not looking at past politicians, but in a political present, you need to do stuff with the stuff you actually have, and the stuff Europe has is not a politician, but in a way is a statesman, and he embodies the bargaining between political authorities and central banking. I'm referring to Mario Draghi. In this economic and political predicament of a stated goal of building unity out, political unity out of monetary union. You don't have national politicians literally getting at the center stage, but you have urgent and immediate problems to answer to, and the answer, you have answers through speeches by politicians, and you have answers through speeches and actions by the president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi. He argues, he has the guts to argue about political union much more than the leaders. The debate about political union is basically away from Europe since 2-3 years. It's just a blame game and finding a scapegoat. But Draghi is forced to act. And Draghi's steps are interesting to look at if we want to look at the euro not as a potential challenger for the dollar, because as Dario argued, there are a lot of imperial characteristics of the dollar that we need to consider, but we need to talk about Draghi and to follow Draghi's steps in order to understand the path to a genuine European monetary union, which includes the political union, as Stittmeyer bluntly admitted. So we need to consider the fact that the crisis of mutual trust between European countries is a central matter regarding the euro's present and future. It is not just something cultural away from monetary problems. We need to talk about how European democracy could look like with Europe becoming a single state, and we need to consider the fact that the sharing of responsibilities between politicians and central bankers is not a fixed line demanded by scientific laws. It has to do with the bargaining between politics and economics. So you can have in some times of history a situation where central bankers become more political, central politics becomes closer to central banks. It could lead to a dangerous situation, particularly if you have a political void and only a whatever it takes that comes at the stage to fill the void.
Grazie. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Alessandro. I think that we produced a fair amount of sound bites, and now it's up to you to ask any question, or if you have a curiosity about the things we talked about, we are here to answer them. And I'd like to collect your questions, if you have some. Please. Can you give me your name, please? Alberto.
Hi. So thank you for the seminar. It was very interesting. One thing, so you basically pointed out how power and state, the concept of state and the concept of currency are strictly related. What about multinationals? So like multinationals are entities which work kind of over the level of states, and they do not have their own currency, but the perceptions I have, or we have, is that they're very strong as a source of power. And so the question was, how do these two separate entities interrelate?
Thank you, Alberto. Other questions, because I'd prefer to collect questions and then give you some answers if you have some. Please go on.
Thank you very much.
No, it doesn't work.
Hi, Riccardo. Thank you very much. The question is, Mario Draghi is certainly not naive, and he knows what he's doing. What will be the next move of the United States concerning this quantitative easing policy that Europe decided to start to begin?
Thanks.
Right. Stefano, so I got two questions. So the first one is, why would we want like the euro to become the global trade currency instead of the dollar? I mean, what would be the advantage for us or such? And then the other question would be, yeah, like talking about like Standards and Poor's or like this rating agency. So, I mean, I guess it's sort of linked to his question about like multinational company and like company that pretty much owns this rating agency and how they can sort of like interact with the government level. That sort of thing.
Thank you. Please.
Okay, Antonio, just a simple question because before you talked about kind of trap that, yeah, economics is not my field, but I try to understand this trap in which China is inside. So my question is, if there are these links about power and money and political organization, so how many freedom do we have to solve some problems that we have in the world? Like if European Union wants to solve a problem, how many degrees of freedom they have to do that, and how many other constraints do we have?
So you mean how sovereign are we? This is your question. What degree of sovereignty we still have?
Yes,
Okay.
I mean there are many issues we have to deal with about markets, investments, assets, and balances. So how is it possible to take a move on doing something?
I'll try to answer the one on how the EU reacted, as I got it right, to the U.S. I'm sorry, how the U.S. reacted to the euro quantitative easing. Well, the Americans were actually pressuring the Europeans to take such a step, even some years back, simply because, as they said, first, euro was considered a threat to the dollar. Now it's not considered a threat, but Europe is still the main trading partner for the U.S. And of course, the U.S. administration felt threatened by the fact that the euro might collapse altogether. So they actually moved on from a condition of feeling challenged by the euro, then to a condition as in fearing for its own demise. So yeah, I believe the U.S. wouldn't do much to euro quantitative easing, even if quantitative easing, as they hope, will be effective and will have positive outcomes. On rating agencies, that's a really interesting topic, to say the least, because rating agencies are usually considered, and we go back to what we said before, to rule of law and soft power. Soft power is highly related to rating agencies. What I mean is, when you have a country that is considered trustworthy, when its own propaganda, soft power, so to speak, it's considered neutral, or at least less biased than others, that's what makes rating agencies being effective. The trick, let's call it the trick, is for the U.S. to let these rating agencies be independent. They can make their own ratings. They're not, well, to some extent they are pressured, but they're not that pressured. Because the trick is that by being in New York City, where the headquarters of the main three rating agencies are, just by being in New York City, by being struck by U.S. propaganda, by being Americans, they will pursue U.S. national interest by default, so to speak. In China, Chinese didn't understand this very nuance, I'd say. Just a quick example, they have their own rating agencies, and the main Chinese rating agency is called Dagong. Dagong feels highly pressured by the Chinese government when it makes its own judgments. Now, actually in February 2015, which means a few days ago, The last ratings they had was, the ratings as they work, right? There are AAA, you have AA. It depends on how safe a debt is considered relating to a country or other institutions, etc. And in February, Hong Kong considered the Russian debt safer than the American debt. The Russian debt, notwithstanding the capital flee and the ruble crumbling, was still considered safer for political reasons by the Chinese than the American debt. The Russian debt had a rating of A, and the US debt had a rating of A-. It's not a detail. That means that investors, as we said before, do not tend to invest as much as they do in the US in China, because they do not trust the institutions they're going to have to deal with. So rating agencies are important tools. Sometimes they even decide of life and death for several institutions and countries. Of course, economical death, so to speak. And soft power has got a lot to do with that, and has to be sophisticated, cannot be blatantly political.
So concerning the euro as a challenger, I think that really the point was the survival of the euro. In an increasingly global stage, likely challenger for the reasons and the advantages of global reserve currency that Dario talked about could be Asian, not European. So the point of the euro was the euro very survival. The fact, if you take the European Central Bank mandate, it has to do, of course, with the stability of prices, but in theoretical terms, you can talk about the stability of something that isn't there. So the survival of something comes before the stability of something, because if something doesn't survive, it can't be stable. That's just an hint of this. And the issue of state and multinational corporations and other entities, I think we need to be pragmatic on this. There's no, I didn't want to push too much in the direction of just the state rules everything. It's, of course, it's not like this. For example, we have empires that are related with the corporations. The prominent example is information empires. Multinational corporations in the digital economy, they can be really considered empires, because they are increasingly relevant in the part of power that has to do with information, which is increasingly relevant in the global division and sharing of power. There are also important involvements of the state in the economy. Consider, or of former state entities. Consider the Italian stock exchange. We still have Eni, Italy's top industrial global company, which Eni's weight within the Italian stock exchange is, I don't know the latest figure, but about 1/5 of our total stock exchange. And former state entities are very relevant in Italy's economy. So you have this process of bargaining between state entities and non-state entities who can act a little bit by the the former East India Company or entities like this that we have seen in human history before. The point I was making is just the state is still in the game, and it's important to consider this relevance in this process of global bargaining. Just a simple hint on how sovereign are we. There are always constraints. I mean, absolute freedom. I don't know if you're more familiar with physics than me. I think there's a debate after Heisenberg about this stuff, but also in political and economic reality, there are constraints. You want some money on the markets, you need to be trusted by the markets. If you don't want it, just go another way, tax your citizens. If you are making a move, you have constraints. That's a point. But you need to be clear in your political strategy, and you need to move. You need to be solvent within the term of your constraints. You need to build a space where you have some freedom to do the things that matter most to you. So you need to have a space of sovereignty. Just do not follow the fable of absolute sovereignty, because there are constraints. But if you build to yourself too many constraints, you're going to pay for losing even the small share of freedom that is necessary to exert political and economic power.
If I may add just a couple of sentences about the relation between a multinational corporation and a state. Let's take the example of Google, to stay in the area of information technology. If the US government needs some kind of strategic information about, let's say, the Islamic State, or about European terrorists, or about I don't know what, or about the Russian or Chinese about us. They have, I would say, more or less free access to Google. If Mr. Putin or Mr. I don't know are interested in having some information from Google, I don't think that they have a share in that. It's a multinational corporation, of course, but any multinational corporation has, in my view, some kind of, I would say, management culture, which is related to the environment, which is related to the history of the corporation, which is why we have a central bank, the European Central Bank, not in Athens, but in Frankfurt. There is a reason why, I think. And this we should have always in our minds, that multinationals are multinational agencies to a certain point, not absolutely. Other questions? Please go on, and then you.
So I was interested in the speech of Mr. Fabbri when he was talking about China lowering their assets of T-bonds that they have by 100 billions, if I go right. And then it was found out that Belgium was in some kind of way balancing this lowering of T-bonds held by China by increasing their T-bonds. So I wanted to know if you have some kind of more detail about this, and if it was some kind of connection, so Belgium knew about China, so it was like trying to balancing like willingly, or if it was just by chance, and how comes that Belgium invests so many money in T-bonds when they don't have like oil, they don't, I mean, so.
Prova. Hello, I'm Gianna, and I'd like to ask you is what do you think about the impact of a TTIP agreement? If,
Prova. My name is Antonio. You were talking before about the moment that we are living. We are in the information technology. The digital economy is what is emerging all around the world. And we know how the corporation behind the digital economy, how much they are powerful. You were talking about us Bitcoin, that as we know, I don't know if we know very well everyone what is Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is an experiment of a peer-to-peer network in which there is no server, and if there is no server, there is no organization that can control the value stored written somewhere, but it's a software that everyone can install in a computer and is used to exchange information about how much money you have, how much money in the sense of Bitcoin. Recently, Microsoft, that is a big corporation, is an American corporation, the one that is behind the dollar, announced that they will start to accept Bitcoin payments in UK. And there are always more news about companies that maybe want to do something with Bitcoin. You were saying that, for example, China today, we can make an example, this allow a great digital company like Google to do things in China because they know that the information technology, the information is a control today. And so they prevent the exchange of information through corporations that control servers that are in other countries and therefore that can lend to problem for security for the information, the control of the information. I just did this preamble and I want to do two questions. First, do you think that Bitcoin really being something not related to a server, but being something peer-to-peer, so related to people, do you think that the big states around the world will allow Bitcoin to grow? First question. And second, if this will happen, is this the signal of the start of a sort of digital empire, something that is like a new world order or something like that?
May I remember that this conference is open also to non-Italian speakers. Huh? And as far as the Bitcoin is concerned, we have an interesting article by Raffaele Mauro in this issue of Limes. But we have different questions, so maybe Dario may start answering, and then you.
I'll answer the one relating to Belgium. Well, phenomenon that big don't happen by chance. U.S. authorities believe, and I think they're kind of confident that there was an agreement between China and Belgium. Belgium is a country, as you said, that don't live on commodities, don't have much liquidity for that reason, but it's got a lot of economical problems. So they need fresh cash, and Chinese probably promised fresh cash, just as they do in Greece, for example, as they'd like to do here in Italy. So yeah, there was an agreement, and just considered this stat. Belgium now holds, as I said before, $350 billion, which is not something that maybe don't say much to us, but it's the 70% of their GDP. So basically, they have the 70% of what they produce in U.S. dollars, in U.S. deposits, in the U.S. Doesn't make
Part of the euro.
and they're a part of the euro. It doesn't make sense unless you have, yeah, and the so-called capital of the European Union is in Belgium, as we know. So it doesn't make sense unless you have someone behind you that it's paying for it. The other, just a quick answer on Bitcoin, then I'll leave it to you to, if you want to talk Bitcoin a bit much. To answer, if governments, as I got it right, will allow Bitcoin to be used to grow, as for instance. Microsoft, as you said, has been using Bitcoin, also PayPal and other companies, but they still need the permit coming from the government. This is not a detail. You can create a peer-to-peer currency, as you said, but you will need a government, a sovereign entity to say, yes, you can do that. It's not a detail. That's why they pay a lot of money lobbying in Washington, a lot of money, very much, because they know that at the end of the day, you're going to have to talk with someone who's got the armed forces, who's got the sovereignty, who's got the capacity to impose its own will. You do not have that, even if you're a netizen, as they say in the U.S., or someone who works in the internet.
Maybe, yeah. Well, Europe. I mean, let's start from two facts. The single market is an important part of the European process of integration, and commercial agreements are discussed directly by Brussels, because this is one of the few real powers of the European Union as we know it now. So it's certainly an important part. On Europe, if we take Europe's perspective of strengthening market relations between the European Union and the United States, of course you can also see it as a kind of NATO light, another part of close political and geostrategic relationship between the European Union and the United States. There has been some debate in Europe, particularly in the last 6 months, I'd say, about the TTIP and its the clauses it might include, for example, the so-called ISDS clause on the likelihood of, for example, companies bringing to court states, something that happens already at the global level. So there is of course a concern and a debate about the boundaries between political interests and commercial interest. The political interest and the commercial interest of the Atlantic community, which is behind the TTIP, makes sense, I guess. It depends in how much you want to put even more emphasis and relevance on the TTIP in trying to make it a pillar of a new liberal order. I don't think that it is enough in order to build a kind of Bretton Woods consensus where Europe and the United States played the role that played after World War II, because the world has significantly changed, and the U.S. remains very relevant, but the European Union is certainly in need of a strategy. On just a little bit on digital new world order, I think Raffaele Mauro is certainly more an expert on Bitcoin than me, and he, as Lucio said, his article covers a lot the issue. The digital transformation is a relevant transformation for all things related with power. Of course, information, but even weapons, satellites, artificial intelligence. So we can imagine a lot of developments in these sectors that are going to be relevant for a definition of sovereignty for a medium long-term perspective, and companies who have who have the resources to invest in it and the government relations to exploit them are going to be significantly relevant, even for getting out from economic troubles. If you think about how much the digital economy is relevant on this, so an increasing it is very likely to see an increasing relevance in terms of power of these digital entities. But we should maintain the relationship between those companies and governments. I concur with Lucio and Dario's opinion on this.
Other questions, other curiosities, please, sir. You are coming from Belgium, I assume.
Thank you for the nice talks. My name is Yang. I have a couple questions. So first, do you think there is an intrinsic flaw in the design of the euro? So as we know now that the exchange rate of euro is going almost parity with euro in the recent days, no? Yeah. Almost parity.
With the dollar, yes.
Yeah, with US dollar, sorry. Then if yes, then is there any solution to get around this problem? Then the last question is, what's the future of the euro? Will it collapse? Thanks.
No. Simply question. Okay. Other that simple question? No.
It's your turn, Lucio.
Huh?
It's your turn.
Okay.
One question more.
Cater to you.
So start answering that, please.
What will happen to the European architecture? Well, it's hard to say. If you judge from what we said, yeah, there's an intrinsic flaw, as you mentioned. Believing that you can have a currency without a sovereign state behind it, it's a flaw. But not only that, you cannot have that, but let's just assume for a minute that it's possible. Now you have at the center of this construction a country, Germany, that is the most important country for economical reasons, but doesn't have strategic depth, doesn't think in strategic terms, just like Italy, for example. If you had Italy at the center of such an architecture, it wouldn't work. Germany is an export-driven country. It actually draws money. It takes money out of the system. In the past 4 or 5 years, we saw money decreasing in circulation inside the European Union. And it cannot last longer, or cannot last for long, because at least even maybe you could have transfer fund management, transfer fund mechanisms, where you take money out of the system and then you give back the money to other countries in some other way, something that the Germans do not understand, or if they do understand, they don't want to implement, or the system cannot work. We were just experienced vis-a-vis Russia, towards Russia when it comes to Germany. Germany is only driven by export and economical interests. Doesn't have strategic depth. And I conclude, and then I pass the ball to Lucio. You can have, maybe you can have, I do not agree with that, but you cannot have a strategic country without a state behind it, and even more so, you cannot have a currency without a state behind it and not even have a strategic country at the center of the system. We lack these very two aspects, and to have the European Union to grow in the future, it might even grow, but it cannot be what we thought it'd be, and it cannot be, for sure, a challenger, if you want it to be, a challenger to the U.S. as the global leader. That won't happen with this European Union.
As I said before, the euro is a non-logic construction. You don't usually build a new currency from the roof without having some kind of fundamental roots, namely state institutions. But now we have that. And what are the consequences? We see that on that map, the fact that we are going each nation their own way. What will this bring about in the near future? I don't know, but I think that the real issue at stake is whether the European Union will survive the euro, rather than that the euro will be still alive in a couple of years. And when I say the European Union, I say at the same time the European nation states, to some extent, some of them, including ours, and societies, because let's remember, we started in 2007, 2008 with a financial crisis, which was brought about by a mismanagement, let's put it this way, in the financial private sector in the United States of America. Then we had a global crisis, which was still financial. Then we have an economic crisis. Then we had a political, and now we have a social crisis too in Europe. And we have, in many countries, including Italy, political parties or lobbies or groups which are questioning the very sense of our integration and which are lobbying in favor of new states, old states which have to be reinvented, etc., etc. We have a certainty. In this kind of process, Europe will still be non-relevant in the global scene. Some European states, maybe Germany and France, still have a relevance, but less and less, I would say, first. Which means that, to answer the question of another guy, we are less free, of course, because the decisions are decided elsewhere, not here. Secondly, we did put our democracies at stake, because if you try to have a currency which is governed by a kind of technical management, the ECB, you have two possibilities. Either it doesn't work, or this management becomes a political power. And what we are having now is Mr. Draghi and the ECB Council being a de facto political power in Europe, because they have to do what others are willing or able to do, namely to have a political union and to have, by consequence, an economic policy in Europe, one and not many. So I'm not so optimistic about the future of Europe. Maybe we will have in a couple of years still this currency in our pockets, but it may be that the institutions and the democracies, at least some of them, which we managed to build after World War II, may be collapsing before the collapse of the currency. And I hope not, but it would be, in my view, foolish to not think of the consequences of what we have now built, namely what we don't have built, a political union for a common currency.
If you think on the euro, if you think about les 30 Glorieuses in France and the Italian miracle, we built our hope of a society and our social model after the reconstruction in after World War II. We are not going to have something like this. We are not never going to see rates of growth like we had before. This is another world that we can't have, simply can't have back. But we haven't really adapted to this world, even if the European social model that we built as elements of preciousness. So this is a basic problem. Another basic problem, simple and down to earth, that I see is we don't speak the same language. That's a problem that needed to be solved. In some states, it has been solved. In Italy, it hasn't been solved, for example, and in a lot of other states, I do not think that Europe might ever be able to play a role if we don't speak English. I mean, everybody in Europe needs to speak English. In a proper way, or Italian. we need to pick a language and to have a common language. So I think this is a main flow, a simple thing, but a main flow. And as I see the future, we will continue to muddle through, because the pilot wants to muddle through. Germany's culture, in Germany's present culture, in this environment, is to muddle through and to go through small steps. So there's not going to be a major upheaval on the positive side, but maybe there won't be also upheavals on the negative side. My guess is that the euro will survive, and we will find ourselves in 5 years with the ability to muddle through continuously, brought mainly by the international recovery, new drivers of growth in Africa and elsewhere. So we'll be able to export something more, and this will give the leadership the chance to continuously muddle through in this European predicament. So if you want my blunt forecast, it is like this.
Still time for a last question, if there is any.
Just a comment. Luca speaking. The maps that you see are Mercatore projections and not Peter's projections. Actually, there is a bias in the sense that when you show the map of the world, there are states that are represented bigger than others.
Also in the Peter's projection.
But the surface is constant. Yeah. And so I'm saying that because African and South American countries from which energy is taken from, and I'm talking about lithium or uranium, in every world map are very small. So to make things fair, representing them as Peter's projection would focus the attention on small countries having all the power, dragging energy from large countries having no power at all. And I think presenting information is important since we are a child. Otherwise, we grow up with a distorted image of power versus resources. Thanks.
You know, when you have to put 3 dimensions into 2, you have always to distort. It's impossible, but it's very interesting because the way you distort says much about you. If you go, for example, in the United States, you will see the maps of the world which are centered on America. If you go to Japan, you will see the same maps centered on Japan. We are in Europe, we center our maps on Europe. So maps always lie. Question is why they lie in one way or the other. But they say much, they say the truth about our vision of the world. Our maps, by the way, we have the author of our maps here, Laura Canali, are not meant as, of course, geographical maps, but they are meant as a tool for illustrating our geopolitical analysis. And I think it's very interesting to compare how maps are drawn by different political actors. That's very, very relevant. By the way, those of you who may be interested in this kind of discussion are kindly and warmly invited to the Palazzo Ducale conference, which will start this afternoon and which will last up to Sunday evening. The issues which will be discussed there are those we started to discuss now here, namely dollar, euro, etc., but also how do markets work, for example, or how other global actors, for example, the Catholic Church, do with their treasury, if you wish, or even the Caliph. And the mafias, by the way, we know that in times of economic crisis, the mafias have a specific power, namely the power of holding large amounts of liquidity, which is what we lack now, and so forth and so on. One last thing about the lingua franca. As you know, Italy is not an empire, but we have a kind of empire inside our territory, namely the Vatican. And the Vatican has a lingua franca, which is not English but Italian, so let's be hopeful about our language. Ciao.